Tom, I'm not familiar. The official royal family website speaks for itself. Exploiting royal status for personal benefit is nothing new, but those misrepresenting the monarchy to harm the nation should be examined with great care.
Being a prince, I'd have thought royal engagements came with the territory. Apparently not. A few individuals seem rather too taken with their own authority. Still, my mother is a queen of uncommon resilience.
Prince William stood in a narrow side corridor of Buckingham Palace with the kind of absolute stillness that only arrives when anger has burned past volume and settled into something colder and more permanent. It was 4:17 in the afternoon on Thursday, 11th June 2026, 2 hours into the annual summer garden party, and the Prince of Wales had just been handed a small black device no larger than a matchbox. The device had been recording continuously for 43 minutes. The man who had been wearing it until protection officers removed it was Tom Parker Bowles, son of the Queen Consort, stepbrother by marriage to the future king, and a man who had decided that the private conversations, unguarded expressions, and controlled atmosphere of a royal event were raw material for personal content. This is not a story about a minor lapse in manners. This is the story of a calculated attempt to extract value from the monarchy by covert filming, of a relative who treated access as inventory, and of the heir to the throne who responded with institutional finality. By nightfall, Tom Parker Bowles had been barred from every future royal occasion, public or private. He had been forbidden, in writing, from leveraging any residual connection to the crown to advance private commercial projects, sponsorships, books, or digital content. The decision was not theater, it was self-defense. Before we go further, if you are new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The consequences of this afternoon are still unfolding, and the palace has not finished drawing lines. The garden party on the 11th of June 2026 was meant to be ordinary by the standards of the household. 3,000 invited guests moved across the lawns of Buckingham Palace under a high, clear summer sky. The guest list followed the usual careful formula: charity workers, military officers, community volunteers, a thin layer of society names, and a scattering of people whose quiet service had earned them an afternoon inside the gates. The king had been present for the first hour, moving along the predetermined path with the practiced economy of someone who has done this for decades. The Prince and Princess of Wales arrived shortly after 3 o'clock. Catherine wore pale blue, the kind of understated color that photographs cleanly without competing with the occasion. Their children were not present. William and Catherine had long since stopped bringing George, Charlotte, and Louis to large garden parties. The risk of uncontrolled images and the exhaustion of constant vigilance had made the decision permanent years earlier. Tom Parker Bowles was on the guest list as a matter of residual courtesy. After the financial storm that had stripped his mother of her titles the previous December, the family had maintained a polite, distant relationship with Camilla's children. Invitations still went out for the larger, more public occasions. No one expected trouble. Tom had always been the more visible of the two: food writer, restaurant critic, occasional television presence, and for years the connection had been treated as mildly useful background rather than a problem. What no one outside a very small circle knew was that Tom had arrived with a plan. For the better part of a year, he had been building a second career in short-form video. His traditional writing still paid the bills, but the real growth sat online. He had launched a personal channel under a slightly altered name, posting carefully edited clips about life adjacent to the palace. The videos never quite crossed the line into open name-dropping, yet every frame left the viewer with the impression of insider access. The algorithm rewarded the ambiguity. View counts climbed. Sponsorship inquiries began arriving in the inbox. One production company had floated a series concept titled Royal Adjacent, a glossy examination of the people who orbit the monarchy without holding titles. Tom needed exclusive material that felt closer than anything previously released. A garden party full of recognizable faces, unguarded moments, and the soft power of the institution itself was the perfect hunting ground. The camera was a commercial micro device marketed for discreet documentation. It clipped inside a jacket lapel, recorded in high definition with surprisingly clean audio, and stored footage on an encrypted card that could be wiped in seconds. Tom had tested versions of the device at 2 earlier semi-private events and walked away unnoticed. On the 11th of June, he activated it shortly after clearing the final security checkpoint. For the next 43 minutes, the lens captured conversations near the tea tent, a brief exchange between William and a visiting Commonwealth High Commissioner, Catherine, speaking with a group of nurses from a London hospital, and several moments of palace staff coordinating the flow of guests with quiet efficiency. It also captured Tom himself offering low, running commentary under his breath, exactly the intimate, slightly conspiratorial style his growing online audience preferred. The discovery was almost accidental, which made it more damaging. A member of the Royal Protection Detail, standing at a fixed point near the East Terrace, noticed Tom adjusting his lapel with unusual frequency and consistently positioning himself at angles that kept certain people in frame. The officer did not confront him on the lawn. He simply watched for several minutes, confirmed the pattern, and reported upward through the chain. Within 12 minutes, a senior officer approached Tom under the polite fiction of a message from the household and guided him, still smiling, into a small anteroom off the East Gallery. The camera was requested. Tom handed it over with the easy confidence of someone who expected the matter to be smoothed over. When the officer reviewed the most recent minutes of footage on a secure tablet, that confidence fractured. William was informed at 4:05 p.m. He left the main lawn without announcement, walked the private corridors that guests never see, and entered the anteroom where Tom waited with 2 protection officers. Catherine remained outside, continuing the surface of the afternoon with the same controlled grace she had perfected over years of public duty. Only later would staff who had been near the door describe the atmosphere inside that room as Arctic. William did not raise his voice at the beginning. He asked to see the device. He watched approximately 30 seconds of the recording, enough to register the commentary, the framing, the clear intent. Then he looked at Tom and spoke with the flat precision that people who know him have learned to treat as a warning. You brought a hidden camera into my family's home to film people who did not consent, including my wife, so you could turn it into content for money. Tom began the expected defense. It was only for personal use. He had no intention of releasing anything sensitive. He was simply documenting the atmosphere for a possible future project that would be tasteful and respectful. He had grown up around these events. He understood the boundaries. William let him finish the entire speech. The silence that followed was longer than the defense itself. "You recorded private conversations," William said. "You recorded my wife speaking with people who came here as guests, not as material. You recorded staff who cannot refuse an invitation and cannot protect themselves from someone using residual family access. You did it while smiling, shaking hands, and accepting the hospitality of the household. That is not documentation. That is extraction." The conversation lasted 11 minutes. There were no theatrics, no raised voices that carried into the corridor. What carried instead was the finality. By the end of those 11 minutes, Tom had been told, in language that left no interpretive space, that he was no longer welcome at any royal event, public or private, for the foreseeable future. The ban covered the residences, the official engagements, the family gatherings that had still included Camilla's children out of residual politeness after the previous winter's upheaval. William added a second, sharper prohibition. Tom was forbidden from leveraging any residual royal connection, his mother's former title, his own previous access, any photograph, anecdote, or implication of ongoing proximity, to promote commercial ventures, sponsorships, publishing projects, or digital content. If he did so, the palace would respond publicly and without the usual careful understatement. William's private secretary was summoned while Tom was still in the room. Instructions were issued before Tom left the palace grounds. By 6:30 p.m., the relevant private offices had been notified. By the following morning, the major royal diaries had been updated. Tom Parker Bowles's name no longer appeared on any list that required household approval. What made the speed possible was the climate already existing inside the family. The financial revelations that had removed Camilla from the royal stage in December 2025, had left the institution raw and newly intolerant of blurred lines between private advantage and public trust. William, more than anyone else in the immediate family, had absorbed the practical lesson that proximity to the crown is not a personal asset to be monetized. He had watched his mother's life and death play out under cameras that never switched off. He had spent the better part of 2 decades constructing careful, often unpopular boundaries around his own children. A relative by marriage, treating those boundaries as optional content, was never going to be met with a quiet word and a second chance. The formal letter followed 48 hours later. It was brief, written on Kensington Palace letterhead, and signed by William's private secretary on the prince's direct instruction. It confirmed the ban from all future royal occasions and restated in precise language the prohibition on commercial use of any residual royal association. There was no request for an apology, and none was offered. Tom's solicitors received a copy the same day. So did the head of the royal household and the relevant private secretaries across the senior residences. Tom's initial public response was limited and carefully lawyered. Through a representative, he described the incident as a misunderstanding about personal recording devices and insisted he had never intended to release material that would cause embarrassment. The statement avoided any admission that the camera had been deliberately concealed. Within days, however, fragments of the story reached the more aggressive corners of the press. The palace issued no comment. It did not need to. The simple absence of Tom from subsequent events, most noticeably the private family lunch that traditionally followed the garter service at Windsor and later the smaller summer reception hosted at the castle, spoke with greater clarity than any statement could have managed. Catherine's position was straightforward and absolute. Friends of the couple later said she had been the first to frame the act not merely as a security breach, but as a basic failure of decency. She has never been sentimental about people who treat access as inventory, and she has even less patience for anyone who places her or the children inside that calculation. The 3 children were never told the operational details, but the household's protective routines tightened another visible notch in the weeks that followed. Charles was briefed the same evening. Those present for the short conversation described his reaction as weary rather than explosive. He had already lived through one major betrayal that mixed family loyalty with concealed financial structures. Another that mixed family access with concealed cameras required less emotional processing and produced a faster institutional response. He endorsed William's decision without delay or caveat. The message transmitted to the wider household was simple and unambiguous. The ban stood, and it would be enforced. Camilla's children found themselves in an impossible position in the aftermath. Laura Lopes remained largely silent, continuing her own lower-profile life at a careful distance. Tom, according to people who spoke with him in the following weeks, oscillated between private defiance and public damage control. He canceled 2 scheduled media appearances that had been built around his unique perspective on life near the institution. A planned book proposal that leaned heavily on royal-adjacent anecdotes and observations was quietly withdrawn from the publishers who had been considering it. The online channel that had been growing so promisingly went dark for a full month, then returned with carefully neutral food content and no further hints of palace proximity. The public reaction split along predictable but revealing lines. A portion of the older commentariat treated the ban as excessive, an overreaction by a prince already known for his tight control of image and access. They argued that Tom had grown up inside the outer orbit of the family, and that a single misjudged recording did not justify permanent exclusion. Others, particularly younger audiences, fluent in the language of consent, digital ethics, and the long history of media exploitation of the royal family, saw the decision as overdue and necessary. The idea that a man could walk into a royal garden party with a hidden camera simply because he was family struck many as precisely the kind of soft entitlement the monarchy could no longer afford to indulge. Online, the phrase content over kinship began circulating as shorthand for the entire episode and for a broader cultural argument about what proximity should and should not buy. What elevated the story beyond a simple family quarrel was the principle William chose to enforce. He did not merely remove one man from future guest lists. He drew a bright, public-facing line between blood or marital proximity and the right to extract commercial value from the institution. In doing so, he sent a message that reached further than Tom Parker Bowles. Every person who orbits the royal family, staff, distant relatives, former insiders, professional acquaintances, charity partners, understood that the old informal economies of access, anecdote, and implied endorsement were now under stricter management. The practical consequences accumulated quietly through the second half of the summer. Invitations that had once been almost automatic simply stopped arriving. Photographs that might once have been tolerated on a personal social media account were now treated as potential breaches if they implied continued insider status. Business inquiries that mentioned royal connections in the same paragraph as Tom's name were met with polite but unmistakable distance from organizations linked to the household. One charity that had been exploring a possible collaboration involving Tom as a bridge to royal patronage quietly paused the discussions. Another event organizer who had hoped to use his residual proximity as a soft introduction was told, with bureaucratic courtesy, that the bridge no longer existed. Inside the palace, the episode accelerated conversations that had already been underway about digital security at royal events. Guest lists for garden parties and receptions had always been scrutinized. The scrutiny now included clearer, more explicit guidance on personal recording devices of every kind. Protection officers received updated briefings that treated the possibility of covert filming by non-media guests as a live risk rather than a theoretical one. The informal assumption that family will know the rules was retired without ceremony. For William, the decision carried a personal weight that went beyond protocol and institutional risk management. He has spent his adult life attempting to construct a version of royal existence that does not devour the people inside it. The cameras that followed his mother never switched off, and the consequences of that constant surveillance shaped the entire trajectory of his childhood and adolescence. The cameras that followed him as a young man were relentless in a different register. The deliberate decision to keep his own children's faces largely out of commercial view has been one of the few consistent private policies of his public life, maintained even when it cost popularity or generated criticism about secrecy. A relative treating that hard-won boundary as optional material for a personal vlog was never going to be met with understanding or a second chance. Tom Parker Bowles had grown up adjacent to the institution without ever being fully of it. After his mother's elevation to queen consort and her subsequent dramatic removal, the residual glamour of that adjacency became, for a time, a professional asset that could be converted into attention, sponsorship, and opportunity. The hidden camera at the garden party was the moment the asset was called in and found to be counterfeit. William's response made clear that the monarchy would no longer underwrite anyone's personal brand, regardless of the surname or the history attached to it. By late July 2026, the story had settled into the background noise of royal coverage, overtaken by the ordinary rhythm of summer engagements and the next cycle of speculation. But the ban remained in force without modification. Tom was not present at the private family events of the high summer. He was not among the guests at the reception that followed the king's birthday parade. His name did not appear on the lists for the autumn engagements that once would have included him as a matter of residual courtesy. The commercial projects that had depended on the subtle suggestion of continued access were redesigned, delayed, or abandoned altogether. In the end, the incident of June 11th revealed something simple and rarely stated with such operational clarity. Proximity to the crown is not a content library. Family is not a distribution channel. Access is not an entitlement that survives the decision to treat other people as material. William enforced that distinction with a precision that left no room for creative reinterpretation or quiet rehabilitation. Tom Parker Bowles tested the boundary with a concealed camera and a plan for relevance and monetization. He discovered that the boundary had become a wall, and that the wall was now permanent. The garden party of June 11, 2026 will be remembered, if it is remembered in detail at all, as the afternoon a man brought a secret lens into Buckingham Palace and learned that some doors, once closed by the future king, remain closed. William did not require a press release, a formal decree read aloud, or a public spectacle. He required only the authority he already possessed and the willingness to use it without sentimentality or delay. The result was absolute.